Surrender us.
Medieval England, as we imagine it from films and books, is actually much more complex and interesting than it seems at first glance. We often see only knights in armor and ladies in long dresses, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Behind these images lay a complex world of symbols, traditions, and of course, fashion. Clothing was not just fabric. It was a social passport, a declaration of status, wealth, and ambition. To understand this world, you need to understand the details. Today, we will delve into how members of high society dressed, from kings to knights. We will explore how seemingly simple items became symbols of immense wealth, why certain colors were only available to the elite, and what was hidden beneath the multi-layered garments. Watch the video to the end to find out how one item of clothing could change a person's fate, and which element of the wardrobe was considered the most shameful for a nobleman. In the Middle Ages, color was not just a matter of taste. It was a strict code that instantly told those around you about your status and wealth. Most of the population wore clothes made of unbleached wool or linen, which gave them gray, beige, and brown shades. But for those who could afford it, there was a whole range of bright, saturated colors that were incredibly expensive. The most prestigious colors were purple, scarlet, and deep blue. Purple was obtained from rare sea snails, and its production was so complex and costly that only the monarch and his immediate entourage could wear it. Red, especially bright scarlet, was obtained from cochineal beetles imported from southern countries. Blue dye, obtained from indigo, was also very expensive. These colors were so important that they are mentioned in laws regulating who could wear what. What other colors, besides those listed, do you think were symbols of wealth and power, and why? Write your guesses in the comments. The cost of dyes was determined not only by their rarity, but also by the complexity of their production. The dyeing process required special knowledge, time, and resources. Dyers were a kind of alchemist who used herbs, roots, insects, and minerals to create a palette available only to the select few. Producing durable and rich shades was an art form, and its secrets were passed down from generation to generation. For example, the glands of sea snails called murexes were used to obtain purple dye. Thousands of snails were needed to dye a single robe, making the process incredibly labor-intensive. Collecting, processing, and fermenting were all very costly. This explains why Tyrian purple became a symbol of imperial power in the Roman Empire and later in the Middle Ages. As already mentioned, red was obtained from cochineal, small beetles that lived on cacti in Mexico. When the Spanish brought this dye to Europe, it caused a sensation as it produced a brighter and more durable shade than traditional madder, which gave a duller reddish-brown color. But cochineal was an imported commodity, which meant it was very expensive. Blue was obtained from the woad plant, or indigo. But it was not a simple process. The leaves of the plant had to be fermented in special vats to obtain a paste that was then used for dyeing. An even more intense blue was obtained from Indigofera tinctoria, which was imported from India and Asia. This dye was so valuable that it was called blue gold. The color of clothing was also closely linked to religious and social norms. For example, white symbolized purity and innocence, and was often worn at christenings and weddings. Black, although expensive to produce, was associated with mourning and grief. But in the late Middle Ages, it became popular among wealthy merchants and even some members of the aristocracy because it looked austere and elegant. Yellow had a dual meaning. On the one hand, it was associated with gold and wealth, and on the other, with betrayal and deceit. In some regions, people of certain professions or religions were required to wear yellow clothing. For example, Venetian prostitutes had to wear yellow clothes. Green was a symbol of nature, spring, and hope. It was especially popular with hunters and people associated with the forest. However, it was very difficult to obtain a durable and rich green dye, so bright green clothing was also a sign of wealth. In addition to color, the quality of the cloth was of great importance. England was one of the largest wool producers, and Flemish cities were centers of textile production. Rich people did not just buy fabric, they ordered it from the best craftsmen. The wool used for their clothes was the finest, softest, and smoothest. It did not bite, did not crease, and retained its color beautifully. The process of processing wool was long and laborious. First it was cleaned, then combed, spun, woven, and finally fulled, treated with hot water and soap to make the fabric dense and waterproof. The better this process was, the more expensive the fabric was. The cloth trade was the basis of the economy of many European cities. Italian and Flemish merchants made fortunes from it. That is why clothes made of high-quality cloth, especially those dyed in rare colors, were available only to very wealthy people. It was not just clothing, but an investment that showed a person's financial status. The influence of color and materials was so great that in England, as in the rest of Europe, laws on luxury were passed. These laws regulated who could wear which fabrics, colors, and styles of clothing. The goal was simple: to preserve the social hierarchy and prevent commoners from copying the style of the rich. For example, in the 14th century, a law was passed prohibiting anyone who was not a member of the nobility from wearing clothes decorated with gold and silver threads, as well as silk and velvet. Laws could also regulate the length and width of clothing, the amount of fur and jewelry. Violation of these laws was punishable by fines and even imprisonment. Therefore, when we look at paintings and tapestries from the Middle Ages, we see more than just fashion. We see a strict system in which every element of clothing was carefully thought out and had its own meaning, and color was one of the main indicators of status and power. If color showed status from afar, fabric did so up close. Wool was the most common material, but even it was divided into many varieties. Coarse wool was available to everyone, while fine, soft, and expensive wool was reserved for the nobility. Rich people preferred wool produced in England or Flanders, which was known for its quality. However, fabrics imported from abroad were considered the height of luxury. Silk, which came from Byzantium and China via the Silk Road, was a symbol of incredible wealth. It was worn by kings and very wealthy merchants. Another prestigious material was velvet, which appeared later but quickly gained popularity thanks to its softness and rich appearance. The quality of fabric was not just a matter of comfort, but also a sign of financial well-being. In the Middle Ages, there was a strict hierarchy of fabrics that reflected a person's social status. The coarse, unprocessed wool worn by peasants and artisans was cheap and practical, but it did not retain heat well and wore out quickly. Meanwhile, the fine, soft wool from Flanders or Florence was so smooth and pleasant to the touch that it was difficult to distinguish from silk. It was made from the wool of rare breeds of sheep, and the processing itself was very labor-intensive. Such fabric was not only more durable, but also retained its color better, which made it even more valuable. In addition to wool, the tables of the wealthy were covered with fabrics that were truly exotic. For example, linen, which was relatively affordable, but its thin and refined varieties were used to make underwear, shirts, and scarves. The thinner the linen fabric, the more expensive it was. There were also fabrics such as camlet, a mixture of camel wool and silk, which had a unique sheen and durability. However, the real divide between rich and poor was created by silk and velvet. Silk was not just clothing, it was a symbol of power, strength, and wealth, accessible only to the most influential people. It was brought along the Silk Road, which made it incredibly expensive. Silk dresses and tunics were often decorated with gold and silver thread embroidery, which further increased their value. These were not just clothes, but an investment that could cost a fortune. Velvet appeared in Europe later, but quickly became a favorite of the nobility. Its soft, dense texture and deep color created a feeling of luxury and grandeur. Velvet dresses and doublets were very popular at formal receptions and celebrations. The production of velvet was very complex, requiring special looms and great skill, which made it very expensive. Importing expensive fabrics was not just a whim. It was part of a complex international trade system that allowed England to access goods from all over the world. Italian cities such as Venice and Genoa were the main trading gateways for silk and spices from Asia. Flemish cities such as Ghent and Bruges were centers of high-quality wool production. England was rich in wool, but in order to gain access to the most expensive and prestigious fabrics, it had to trade with other countries. This trade was risky and dangerous. Caravans traveling along the Silk Road could be robbed, and ships sailing across the sea could sink. This is why imported fabrics were so expensive. Buying silk or velvet was not just a purchase of clothing, but a kind of demonstration of one's influence and access to international trade routes. Ultimately, fabric was one of the main tools for creating social barriers. Clothes made of coarse wool immediately distinguished a peasant from a knight, while a silk robe showed that you were dealing with a person of great power and wealth. It was not just fashion, but a system that helped maintain the social hierarchy in the Middle Ages. Why was it necessary to spend such huge sums of money on foreign fabrics when local producers could provide high-quality wool? Did these people ever think that while they were chasing fashion, their lives could be shorter than they imagined? To find out how one item of clothing could change a person's destiny, watch the video to the end. Medieval headwear for the nobility was not just an accessory, but a true work of art and architecture. At that time, complex, tall structures appeared that emphasized status and separated their owners from the common people. Men often wore chaperones, complex headdresses that could be draped in various ways. In the late Middle Ages, they became so popular that they were worn by both ordinary and very wealthy people. But the difference was in the quality of the fabric and decorations. For special occasions, nobles wore hats with feathers, which symbolized their nobility and knightly valor. Women's headdresses were even more elaborate. The most famous example is the inentinoinen, a tall cone-shaped headdress that could reach almost a meter in height. It was often decorated with a veil made of thin fabric that fell to the shoulders or even to the ground. Wearing such a headdress was very uncomfortable, but that did not stop fashionistas. The higher the ene, the higher the status of its owner. Men's headwear in the Middle Ages came a long way from simple caps to complex designs. Initially, in the early Middle Ages, men wore simple hoods or knitted caps, which were practical and protected against the cold. But with the development of fashion and the emergence of new fabrics, headwear began to take on more complex forms. The chaperone is perhaps the most interesting example. Initially, it was a simple hood with a long tail called a liripip. Over time, around the 14th century, men began to wear the chaperone not on their heads but on their shoulders, and then began to tie it into complex shapes resembling a turban. Wearing a chaperone in this way required a certain skill, and to keep its shape, it was often made of thick fabric. Rich chaperones could be made of velvet or silk and decorated with gold buttons or brooches. In addition to the chaperone, men wore other headgear that also indicated status. Berets became popular in the late Middle Ages, especially among artists and scholars. They were practical but elegant at the same time. Rich berets were made of expensive cloth or velvet and decorated with feathers. Feathers were an important symbol. For example, a peacock feather symbolized pride and nobility, while an ostrich feather symbolized exotic wealth, as they were brought from far away. Women's headdresses were even more elaborate and sometimes simply fantastic. The richer the lady, the more complex and taller the headdress she could afford. The enum, or horn, was the height of this fashion. It was a cone-shaped structure that could reach incredible heights. Some enes were so tall that ladies had to bend down to pass through a doorway. These headdresses were made of stiff materials, such as starch fabric or even a wire frame, and covered with expensive fabric. A veil was attached to the top of the ene, which could be made of the finest silk or linen, and it fell down to cover the face and shoulders. The longer and more transparent the veil, the higher the status. But the ene was not the only option. In some regions, women wore horn-like headdresses that were so wide that they had to walk sideways through doorways. Other headdresses resembled crowns or tiaras, but these were usually worn only by noblewomen at formal receptions. Another important element was the plume, a decoration made of feathers. Feathers were attached to headdresses and were a symbol of nobility and knightly valor. For example, ostrich feathers, as we have already mentioned, were a sign of exotic wealth, as they were brought from distant countries. Headwear in the Middle Ages was not only a fashion accessory, but also an important social marker. It helped to instantly determine a person's status. For example, married women always had to cover their heads, while unmarried girls could walk with their hair down. This was not just a rule of decorum, but part of the social code. Thus, headwear was not just an element of clothing. It was a kind of calling card that spoke of a person's wealth, social status, and even marital status. Elaborate, expensive, and unusual headwear was part of the visible luxury that separated the nobility from the common people and helped maintain the social hierarchy. Stereotypical ideas about medieval clothing often include baggy, shapeless tunics, but this was not the case for wealthy people. In the late Middle Ages, men's fashion underwent significant changes, and fitted silhouettes came to the fore. Men began to wear doublets, short, fitted jackets that emphasized the figure. They were often worn over a thin shirt and paired with hose, tight-fitting trousers. The doublet was not just clothing, but also a kind of armor, as sleeves and hose were sewn onto it. It was a symbol of strength, youth, and physical attractiveness. Where did these changes in men's clothing begin, and why did men start wearing such tight-fitting clothes? Perhaps it was done so that women would not think that they alone had to suffer for beauty. To find out how ladies coped with this challenge, watch the video below. Until the mid-14th century, men's clothing was indeed looser. Long tunics and cloaks hid the figure, and the main indicator of status was the length of the tunic and the quality of the fabric. However, with the development of trade and the emergence of new cultural trends, fashion became bolder and more revealing. Men, especially young nobles and knights, began to imitate the image of Italian and French fashionistas, who were the first to wear more form-fitting clothes. The appearance of the doublet was a real revolution in men's clothing. It was a short, tightly fitting jacket that emphasized broad shoulders and a slim waist. The doublet was made of thick cloth, velvet, or silk, and its shape was maintained with quilted lining. Chaps, which were tight-fitting trousers that could be of different colors, were attached to the doublet with laces called punts. This allowed for the creation of bright, contrasting looks. For example, one leg could be dressed in red chaps and the other in blue. Such a costume not only emphasized physical fitness, but was also very practical. Knights could wear doublets under their armor, as they provided additional protection. The doublet was a symbol of a new generation of nobles who were not only rich, but also young, strong, and ready for new challenges. The tight-fitting clothing required new accessories. Small loops were sewn onto doublets and hose, through which punts, laces with metal tips, were threaded. These tips were called eglets and were often made of silver or gold, making them real decorations. The more eglets a person had on their clothes, the richer they were considered to be. In addition, nobles wore belts, which were also an important element of their image. The belt could be made of leather, velvet, or silk, and its buckle was often decorated with precious stones or heraldic symbols. A dagger, purse, or gloves could be attached to the belt, making it not only a decoration, but also a functional accessory. Thus, men's fashion in the late Middle Ages became more complex and sophisticated. It was not just a set of clothes, but a carefully thought-out image that spoke of the strength, wealth, and social status of its owner. Men stopped hiding their figures and began to use clothing to emphasize their best features. This was the beginning of a new era in European fashion, when beauty and elegance became as important as practicality. Women's fashion in the Middle Ages was even more complex. The clothing of a wealthy lady consisted of many layers, each of which had its own function. A thin linen or silk undershirt was the base, and over it was worn a long dress, which could be either simple or very elaborate. In the late Middle Ages, dresses with deep necklines that exposed the neck and part of the chest became popular. This was considered not only beautiful, but also fashionable. Such dresses were often decorated with lacing, embroidery, and precious stones. The sleeves of the dress were also very important. They could be long, wide, or slit to show the undershirt. Women's clothing in the Middle Ages was a complex system where each layer had its own purpose. The basis was the camisa, a long undershirt made of thin linen or, for the wealthiest, silk. The camisa protected the outer clothing from sweat and dirt and also created a smooth base for the dress. It was simple, but its cleanliness and the quality of the fabric spoke of a woman's wealth. The main dress, the robe, was worn over the camisa. In the early Middle Ages, robes were looser and baggier, but in the late Middle Ages, they became more fitted. To achieve the desired silhouette, dresses were laced at the back or sides. This created an accentuated waist and a full skirt. The most expensive fabrics available were used for robes: silk, velvet, and brocade with gold thread. In the 15th century, dresses with deep, wide necklines came into fashion, exposing not only the neck, but also part of the shoulders and chest. This was a bold and revealing step for its time. Such necklines allowed the wearer to show off delicate underwear and jewelry such as necklaces, pendants, and brooches. Deep necklines were especially popular at the Burgundian court and quickly spread throughout Europe, including England. Dresses usually had very long skirts that trailed along the floor. This was not very practical, but it emphasized the wealth of the lady and showed that she was not engaged in physical labor. Skirts were often decorated with embroidery, pearls, and precious stones. The sleeves of the dress were also very important. They could be narrow and long, or, conversely, wide and puffy. One of the most popular styles was sleeves with slits that revealed the undershirt. This was a kind of game, where thin and expensive linen or silk, which was considered part of intimate underwear, was displayed. The sleeves could be removable, allowing them to be changed depending on the occasion. This was very convenient and economical, as it was not necessary to sew a whole new dress. Along with dresses, women wore elaborate headdresses. In addition to the aforementioned Ian, other types were also popular. For example, the yenin was a headdress with two horns located on the sides of the head. They were also decorated with veils and ribbons. Headwear was so important that married women always had to wear it to hide their hair. It was believed that loose hair was a sign of innocence, so only unmarried girls could wear it. Thus, headwear indicated a woman's social status and marital status. In general, women's clothing in the Middle Ages was not just fashion, but a complex social code that spoke of a woman's wealth, status, and marital status. Every element of clothing, from underwear to headwear, had its own meaning and helped create an image that was understandable to everyone in society. For wealthy English people, jewelry was not just a decorative element. It was an investment, a status symbol, and a way to show off their wealth. Gold and silver rings, necklaces, and brooches were commonplace. Brooches were especially popular, used to fasten clothing and decorated with precious stones. They were often engraved with heraldic symbols that indicated membership in a particular family. In addition to jewelry made of precious metals, wealthy people wore belts with precious buckles. These belts could be made of expensive leather, velvet, or silk, and their buckles were true works of jewelry art. Why, if not for beauty, was it necessary to decorate a belt with precious stones? And how difficult do you think it was to walk in shoes that were works of art rather than a means of transportation? Read on to find out the answer to this question. In the Middle Ages, there were no banks as we know them today, and it was unsafe to keep money. Therefore, precious metals and stones served as a reliable investment. Jewelry was not only a way to show one's wealth, but also a bank account that one always carried with them. In the event of war or other disasters, it could be easily taken with you and used to purchase goods, services, or even hire soldiers. Gold and silver, from which jewelry was made, were very valuable. They were mined in Europe, but most of it came through trade routes from Africa and Asia. The more jewelry a person wore, the higher their financial status. Kings and the upper nobility wore gold chains, necklaces, and rings with huge precious stones, which were not just jewelry, but true symbols of power. In addition to their monetary value, jewelry also had symbolic meaning. Rings were often decorated with coats of arms and seals, which were used to authenticate documents. Brooches and buckles with heraldic symbols indicated membership in a particular family. This was very important in a society where nobility was inherited. A person wearing a brooch with a coat of arms immediately made it clear which family they belonged to and what privileges they enjoyed. For example, decorations could feature lions, eagles, lilies, or other symbols that were part of a family's coat of arms. It was not just a decoration, but a kind of passport that could be read. Belts played a special role. They were not only decorative, but also a functional element of clothing. A dagger, purse, keys, or other necessary items could be attached to a belt. Wealthy people wore belts made of expensive materials such as velvet or silk, and their buckles were true works of jewelry art. Buckles could be made of gold or silver and decorated with precious stones. Thus, jewelry in the Middle Ages was not just decoration, but part of a complex system that spoke of a person's status, wealth, family affiliation, and financial position. It was a world in which every item of clothing and every accessory had its own meaning and helped to create an image that was understandable to everyone in society. The shoes worn by wealthy people in the Middle Ages also differed greatly from those worn by ordinary people. While most people wore rough leather boots, the nobility preferred elegant and expensive shoes. Pauline shoes with long pointed toes became especially popular in the 14th and 15th centuries. The length of the toe of the Pauline was directly proportional to a person's status. The longer the toe, the higher their social status. There were even laws that regulated the length of Pauline for different classes of people. Thin, soft leather was used to make these shoes, and they were sometimes even decorated with embroidery. Despite their discomfort, poulous were a symbol of leisure and of a person who did not engage in physical labor. Poulini, or Krakowkas, as they were also called, appeared in Europe in the 14th century and quickly gained popularity among the nobility. This type of footwear was distinguished by a very long, pointed toe, which could reach 60 centimeters in length. To keep the toe in shape, it was stuffed with moss, wool, or even whalebaleen. Polonis were a symbol of idleness and wealth. They were so uncomfortable to wear that it was impossible to do physical labor in them. Moreover, the very long toes made it difficult to walk, so they often had to be tied to the knee with special laces. The length of pulleys was strictly regulated. The laws on luxury that we mentioned earlier also applied to footwear. For example, in England, a law was passed that limited the length of stockings for different classes of people. The king could wear stockings of any length, nobles could wear them up to a certain size, and ordinary townspeople could wear only very short ones. This was done so that the nobility could easily distinguish themselves from the common people. Shoes for rich people were made of thin, soft leather, such as calfskin or goatskin. They were very expensive, but more comfortable and durable than the rough leather worn by peasants. Shoes were often decorated with gold and silver thread embroidery, and sometimes even pearls. Like clothing, shoes were an indicator of taste and status. Shoes could be decorated with heraldic symbols, emphasizing family affiliation. Rich people often ordered shoes from the best shoemakers, who created real works of art. In addition to brogues, which were popular for special occasions, the nobility wore other types of shoes. For example, high boots were used for horse riding, and soft leather slippers were worn at home. Shoes were not just an item of clothing, but also an important element of hygiene. In those days, when the streets of cities were dirty, good shoes protected the feet from dirt and infections. Rich people could afford to have several pairs of shoes for different occasions, while ordinary people had only one pair for all occasions. Thus, shoes in the Middle Ages were not just protection for the feet, but also another tool for demonstrating status and wealth. Poulous, with their incredibly long toes, were a striking example of how fashion could become uncomfortable and even ridiculous, yet remain a symbol of power and prestige. Fur was another important element of clothing that emphasized status. Ordinary people could wear fur, but only from the cheapest animals, such as rabbits. The rich wore fur from ermine, sable, mink, and marten. Ermine fur was particularly prestigious. Its white pelt with black tail tips was associated with purity and royal power. That is why ermine fur adorned the robes of kings and the highest nobility. Fur was used to line clothing and trim collars and cuffs, adding not only warmth but also luxury. The use of fur in clothing was strictly regulated. As with colors and fabrics, there were laws on luxury that determined who could wear which fur. This was done to prevent ordinary people from copying the style of the rich and to keep the social hierarchy intact. The cheapest and most affordable furs were squirrel, fox, and hare. These furs were used to line the clothes of ordinary townspeople and craftsmen, providing warmth during the cold season. However, when it came to the nobility, the choice of fur was completely different. Ermine fur was a symbol of royal power and purity. It was associated with monarchs, as it was believed that an ermine would rather die than soil its white fur. This fur was very expensive, and wearing it was a privilege reserved for the highest echelons of society. Ermine fur was used to trim the robes, crowns, and ceremonial dresses of kings and queens. For example, in paintings and tapestries depicting kings, you can often see robes lined with ermine fur. The white fur with black tail tips, which were specially sewn into the fur, created a recognizable pattern. In addition to ermine, wealthy people wore the fur of other valuable animals. Sable fur, which was imported from Scandinavia and Russia, was very soft and dark. It was incredibly expensive and considered a sign of great wealth. Mink and marten fur were also popular among the nobility. These furs were used to line outer garments, collars, hats, and muffs to keep warm in cold weather. Fur was not only warm, but also an important element of fashion. It added texture, color, and volume to clothing, making it even more luxurious. In the Middle Ages, when homes were poorly heated, fur clothing was not only a luxury, but also a necessity for survival in cold castles and estates. Fur was another striking example of how clothing spoke about a person's status. Every detail in the clothing of the nobility had its own meaning. For example, embroidery on clothing often depicted coats of arms, mottos, or family symbols. It was a kind of personal brand that told those around you which family you belonged to. Buttons and fasteners, which seem commonplace to us today, were luxury items in the Middle Ages. The first buttons were made of bone, wood, or metal. Rich people used buttons made of gold, silver, and even precious stones. They were so expensive that they were often removed from old clothes and sewn onto new ones. Embroidery was one of the most important ways to demonstrate one's status and family affiliation. It bore heraldic symbols that were understood by every educated person. Family crests, mottos, or symbols indicating affiliation with certain knightly orders or royal houses could be embroidered on clothing. Embroidery could be done with gold, silver, or colored threads, making it even more noticeable and expensive. For example, a knight's ceremonial clothing might be embroidered with his personal coat of arms, while a lady's dress might feature her husband's coat of arms and her own. This was a kind of declaration of marriage and union between two families. Buttons, which we take for granted today, were a real revolution in clothing in the Middle Ages. Before they appeared, clothes were fastened with laces, pins, or buckles. Buttons, which appeared in the 13th and or 14th centuries, quickly became very popular, as they allowed clothes to be made more fitted and form-fitting. For wealthy people, buttons were not just fasteners, but decorations. They were made of precious metals, gold, silver, and sometimes even decorated with precious stones. Buttons could be very small, or conversely, very large, and their number on clothing also indicated wealth. For example, a doublet could have dozens of gold buttons, making it very expensive. Buttons were so valuable that they were often passed down from generation to generation. When clothes wore out, the buttons were carefully removed and sewn onto new ones. They were a kind of family capital that could be used at any time. In addition to buttons, buckles, and lacing were important details. Buckles were usually made of metal and decorated with engravings or stones. They were used for belts and shoes. Lacing was very popular for women's dresses, as it allowed the size to be adjusted and emphasized the waist. Laces could also be made of expensive materials such as silk and decorated with metal tips. Thus, every detail in the clothing of the nobility had its own meaning, and no element was accidental. It was a world where clothing was not just protection from the cold, but a complex language that spoke of a person's status, wealth, family affiliation, and taste. In the end, the clothes of a rich person in the Middle Ages were a real language. The color showed access to rare dyes. The fabric showed trade connections and wealth. The style showed following fashion and social status, and the decorations showed family and accumulated wealth. It was not just an outfit, but a complex system of signs that allowed each person to determine their place in society. In essence, every time a nobleman left his home, he left with a carefully crafted message for the whole world. Clothing in the Middle Ages was a visual code. A person could understand another's social position, wealth, family status, and even profession just by looking at them. If today we can determine a person's status by the make of their car or the brand of their watch, in the Middle Ages, it was enough to simply look at their clothes. Luxury laws were created precisely to maintain this order. They strictly regulated who could wear silk, velvet, fur, or precious stones. Violating these rules was tantamount to attempting to disrupt the social hierarchy, which was naturally punished. Thus, clothing was a kind of identity card that required no words. It spoke of a person's origins and their place in society. Fashion in the Middle Ages was a driving force that pushed people to show off their wealth. The emergence of new styles, such as fitted doublets or long tunics, was linked not only to aesthetic preferences, but also to the desire to stand out. Clothes became increasingly complex and unusual to emphasize that their owner could afford luxuries that were unavailable to others. Ultimately, medieval fashion was not just a whim, but part of a complex social and economic system. It was a world in which clothing was not just protection from the cold, but a powerful tool that helped people navigate society and maintain the existing order. We have seen that clothing in the Middle Ages was much more than just fabric. It was a real language, full of symbols and signs that everyone understood. Color spoke of access to rare dyes, fabric spoke of connections with distant countries, and style spoke of following fashion and social status. Every detail, from gold buttons to long stockings, had its own meaning and helped maintain a strict social hierarchy. Rich people didn't just dress up, they created an image that spoke of their power, wealth, and privileges available only to them. What do you think was the most surprising thing about the clothing of wealthy people in the Middle Ages? Which element of their wardrobe seems the most unusual or even ridiculous to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. To make sure you don't miss our new videos and always learn something new, subscribe to our channel.